What's up? I am David Long. Hope you're doing well today. I'm very proud to be able to share a clip from my talk on Sacred Naturalism on the Integral stage. I also hope that you go to the Integral stage and you check out the full-length video because it's got Michael Dowd on there and my good buddy Kai, as well as some other great talkers. You're going to want to check out this talk because we're also going to have a panel discussion coming out later where we dig into these topics deeper. Without any further ado, what's up? How you doing today? I am David Long. You probably know me as a YouTuber and the founding member of the Integral Emergentist Revolutionary Movement, or Integral 2.0. Today I'm going to be talking to you about sacred naturalism, or better put, an integral approach to the healthy and skillful integration of religion and spiritual practice. Before we get started, I'd like to give a big thanks and a big shout out to Bruce Alderman for putting all this together. Thanks so much. It's a true blessing to be able to be here on the Integral stage. Also want to give big shouts out to my buddy Kai, who's also on this video, and I'm super excited and honored about being able to collaborate on this video with Michael Dowd. I've been a huge fan of his for a long time. All right, let's get into it. As an integralist, I feel comfortable with a lot of different worldviews. To me, religious systems are symbol sets. They're almost more like languages than they are creeds or belief systems. So I genuinely feel like I could identify as an agnostic, an atheist, a Christian, a Buddhist, a pagan, and an integral philosopher. And all of these things are consistent with one another and harmonize with each other. I'm not talking about picking from the buffet of religion and just taking what I want based on my own preferences. I'm talking about having a skillful integration based on a rigorous methodology and understanding of overarching patterns and underlying themes. I'm not talking about a case of special pleading. I'm talking about integrating with consistent standards. So how do we do that? Well, first let me say that an integral perspective is a postmodern perspective. At a postmodern stage of development, there is a general deconstruction of meaning and value. We realize that all language is just word games that we're playing with each other. And at a certain point, all we have to communicate anything is symbols and poetry and storytelling. And what we also realize is that even our logical, rational, objective facts and truth is just a really well qualified, really consistent, and really accurate type of storytelling. So I'm not talking about creating a flatland where we say that no symbols are more accurate than others. Clearly, some symbols are better than others for particular things, but it really depends on the context. So we understand that all of our ways of talking about things are a type of relative truth and not the absolute truth. There is no absolute meaning or purpose. And so another one of the problems that arises in postmodernism is this existential crisis of meaninglessness. And if there's no inherent value, there's this kind of fear of this nihilistic void. And on the other side of that, if there's a jewel of existentialism and postmodernism, it's this idea about creating your own meaning and purpose and values. So an integral sacred naturalism is basically a type of belief, not like where you believe that there's inherent meaning or value in the cosmos, but a type of belief like deciding to believe, choosing to see life as sacred, as valuable, as meaningful, as important, as God, as divine, as sacred. And in integral theory, we talk about God in first, second, and third person perspectives, which means that in a first person perspective, I'm God. In a second person perspective, you're God. We're all manifestations of this universe. So everyone's God. Everything, the whole world of nature and the cosmos is itself divine or sacred. And again, this isn't a fact claim. It's a decision about how you want to live your life, how you want to see the world and yourself, and how you think we should meet with each other and value the environment. It's a decision about creating meaning and thus creating a better world through creating a good meaning, creating subjective meaning that's healthy and harmonizes with intersubjective meaning, or create a personal meaning that also is healthy and harmonizes with other people's meaning. For example, it's generally a good thing to treat other people like they're important, that they have value, and that they're sacred. You would hope that goes without saying, but... So, I use these different archetypes of the cup and the sword. These are what I call the transrational tools. The sword is logic, it's rationality, it can make clear discernments and cut through the bullshit. The cup represents poetry and beauty and symbolism and art and archetypes and metaphor and symbolism. The sword is more masculine, the cup is more feminine, and they're intertwined because, as I said before, even our most accurate symbols are poetic. but also poetry makes sense. Michael Dowd basically makes this same distinction, but he talks about day language and night language. What he means by that is that day language, or rationality, the normal way we think about things, has a certain type of logic, while night language or dream language has a different kind of logic. The example that he uses is, imagine if I told you that for lunch I turned myself into a crow and flew over to Dairy Queen and then hung out with the birds for a while. If I was speaking to you in regular day language, you would probably advise me to seek help. But if I told you about a dream I had last night, you would maybe wonder what the dream means. So it's a different way of thinking about the ideas and symbolism, and basically he's making this same distinction. Religious symbolism and metaphor is best understood with night language type logic, and generally when you apply the day language type of logic to it, it breaks down and fails. What happens a lot of times is people end up taking poetry literally and missing the point. So for example, the story of the tortoise and the hare is not about a tortoise and a hare and a race. It's about you and me and how we live our life. And so a lot of religious allegory and mythology is very similar in this way. There's a lot of wisdom and meaning in this mythology. Notice I said the word mythology because I think it's also important to realize that other mythologies and symbol sets, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, The Matrix, the list goes on, are also a form of sacred scripture, of mythology, of human psychology. And as Michael Dowd would probably argue, even our scientific stories and evidence should be looked at as sacred scripture, and even taken more seriously in a day language kind of way, especially if this is some of the most accurate storytelling that we have. So the sword is the boon or the treasure that one earns in the orange stage of development, while the cup is the boon or the treasure that one earns or learns when they're at the green stage of development. And an integralist includes both skillfully, because integral is the synthesis of orange and green. So it's trans-rational, integrating diversity with discernment. It's rational plus. It transcends and includes rationality to also include mythology or poetry, and this is that trans-rationality. So with these tools in hand, I would like to further explore these different titles that I said were coherent and consistent with one another, and explain how exactly that is. Then we'll explore the pros and cons of these different traditions, and how, in a sense, they kind of need each other to be well-rounded. And in that regard, how this integral practice can actually be the best approach to religion and spiritual practice. All right, first and foremost, let's talk about agnosticism and atheism. So in terms of epistemology, as we already mentioned, all we have are language games to be able to reference reality from an inherently limited perspective in time and place. So we not only have subjective limits, but we also have relative limits. And both of these things keep us from knowing the absolute truth. So this is that agnosticism. There are a couple of sayings I really like when it comes to this hard agnostic perspective. Like, not just I don't know, but you don't know either. He who thinks he knows doesn't know. And he who knows he doesn't know knows. In integral, we have a version of it that says the map is not the territory. In other words, the relative map is not the absolute truth of the territory. So we don't get to make claims about the absolute truth. So the agnostic thing is more of a claim about our ability to know the absolute truth. And so in this case, the absolute is God, or God is the ultimate mystery beyond all categories of human thought. And it's often thought of in an anthropomorphized or human-centric kind of a way, where people think there's a literal God or something that's transcendent of all reality, and that it's a person who intercedes in life. So an atheist is a person who doesn't believe in this personal, literal interpretation of God. So in one sense, I'm a hard agnostic. I don't think we can know the absolute mystery of all reality. And also, I don't believe in any of these religious traditions in a literal way. I think there's tons of good poetic value to be had in there, but basically, the general approach that I take to religion is to read it as mythology. And I learned this approach from Joseph Campbell, who is the godfather of comparative mythology. And Ken Wilber even says that he gets the idea of the pre-trans distinction from him. He just requalifies it in developmental terms. So pre and post the rational stage. Pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical. The rational approach is to get evidence to see if something is literally true or not. And the trans-rational approach is to read these symbols metaphorically, as archetypes of human psychology explored through narrative. Basically, humans are trying to understand what's going on in reality. This mystery beyond beyond all categories of thought, and all we have are stories to tell about it. Going back to the hard agnostic thing, this is why Joseph Campbell says that your ultimate name, image, and concept of God is your ultimate boundary from God. Because what happens is that most people end up worshiping some mental idol instead of really being open to mystery. We're talking about vicarious atonement, praying to it, believing in the story literally, and having a superstition about history, instead of realizing that I'm in the desert, I'm being tempted, and how am I going to live? Waking up every day and being it. So religious naturalism is going to find divinity in nature, not in some projection of transcendent glory, but we see immanent reality itself as sacred. So humans are storytellers, and basically these different traditions are more like different languages, different symbol sets, different ways of talking about reality and our experience. Now granted, these religious traditional ways of talking about things are pretty outdated ways of talking about things. However, there are tons of people who do speak these kinds of languages now, and it's good to be able to get in touch with what's going on there. So it's really good to understand what the universal themes are, and to be able to also understand what the different cultural costumes those universal themes come in. So you can know what's universal, and you can understand different traditional variations. And of course, there are personal variations too. So if we go back to the idea of interpreting a dream, there are going to be universal aspects to the symbolism, there are going to be relative cultural aspects to the symbolism, and there are going to be subjective personal aspects to the symbolism. Maybe even all within the same archetype. Like, for example, the archetype of mother is a universal symbol, but there could also be cultural and personal variations on that archetype. Again, we're talking about human psychology. All of these traditions have a concept of God or the absolute or what's sacred or what's ultimate. They all have different conceptions of what that means, but you have to also realize that people who came up with these ideas a long time ago were thinking in a different way. Before we developed these highly rational systems and these incredibly accurate descriptions for things, language in itself was more poetic. You would say Zeus is raining, and it wasn't necessarily even taken that literally by the people who came up with it. And then later on, as development continues, the children of those people start to question whether it was true or not, and start to get in debates about it and argue about it. Again, Michael Dowd uses this example. It's like arguing about whether Uncle Sam is real or not. It misses the point, and it's a confusion about language. So this gets me into two versions of the pre-trans fallacy. Remember earlier we introduced this idea of pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical, and trans-rational ideas are metaphorical or poetic. There are two main types of problems that happen. The first version of the pre-trans fallacy is usually committed by people at a rational stage of development. And what happens is they reduce all religion to childish bullshit. It's all just immature, it's all just the future of an illusion, it's all something to be outgrown. And maybe some people who are watching this are thinking to themselves, Christianity is reducible to believing in a literal Jesus and a literal God, and if you don't believe that, then you're not really a Christian. And maybe it's true that you're not really what most people would consider a Christian, but Christianity, like Buddhism, like paganism, like all of these traditions, has a rich history with diverse translations of symbolism, and whole traditions cannot be reduced to what might now be a single current expression. These traditions are historically born at a more traditional stage of development, but now that they exist, these traditions are interpreted by people at every stage of development. So what it means to be a Christian or a Buddhist or a pagan is different for a young child who's initiated into these traditions or is first hearing about them versus a more mature person or versus a more wise adult. Again, these are more like languages than a particular hard and fast belief system. And if you really understand the history of these ideas, you'll see that this idea of understanding these symbols metaphorically is deep in a lot of these traditions. For example, I'm more of a student of Christianity, but in Corinthians, there's verses about not reading these things in the flesh, but reading them in the spirit. To read them in the flesh is foolishness to most people. They have to be read in the spirit in which they're written. This implies this metaphorical interpretation. I'll give you another example. There's a story in the Bible about the day of judgment where God will cast out the ones that he never knew. And they'll say things like, but Lord, we prayed a million prayers and we cast out demons in your name and we went to church every Sunday. And God will say, yeah, but when I needed a place to stay, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me, you turned me away. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And they'll be like, but Lord, you never came or we would have helped you. And he's like, listen, if you don't see Christ in your brother, then you never knew me. Get away from me. So it's right there in the Bible. I don't know how else you would interpret that. The point is that it's not about paying lip service to it. It's about really recognizing Christ in your brother, recognizing this body of Christ Christ and living as a sacrifice, living as a vehicle of love to help and bless the world. So there's powerful metaphor in there, and this is a great example of why I feel comfortable calling myself a Christian, because I recognize Christ in my brother. I recognize Christ in the world. I recognize that my body is a temple, that I and the Father are one. I try to die to my ego every day and live as a vehicle for God. That's valid poetry about how I try to live my life. I grew up in a very Christian home, so I was very steeped in these ideas, and this more transrational approach, where you wake up every day and you be it, as opposed to just pray to it, actually makes one a better Christian. Now, of course, the other version of the pre-trans fallacy is when you try and lift up pre-rational ideas to trans-rational level that they just are not worthy of. And you see Ken Wilber do this with the idea of I amness before the Big Bang, where he basically believes in some Buddhist or Hindu creation myth and builds his philosophical cosmology around a religious experience and claims to know the absolute truth. This is one example of a pre-trans fallacy number 2, and unfortunately, it is far too common in the integral community. Steve McIntosh is another person who hangs out on the integral scene, and he advocates for belief in a literal God, and he believes there's going to be some kind of future omega point. That's another good example of the pre-trans fallacy. Usually the pre-trans fallacy or pre-trans confusion happens around green, but it's early days for integral still, so the cognitive line runs ahead, and it takes time to learn how to really practice these things, and we're still learning to make these distinctions in clear ways and really live them out. And that is why there needed to be an integral emergentist revolutionary movement or an integral 2.0. But back to the religious traditions. So why not just be an integral Christian then? Why also a Buddhist and a pagan? Why include these other traditions? Well, for one, more symbols to be able to talk about your experience gives you more perspective. And you don't want to become the ultimate nerd for one symbol set. Imagine if you were hanging out with a person and they constantly brought everything back to Star Wars metaphors. Oh, this reminds me of the Force. This is just like when Luke Skywalker unmasks his father. This would be also a good place to pause and to say that someone like Michael Dowd has studied plenty of different symbol sets, and he certainly understands that there are many ways to talk about universal ideas and can probably cross-culturally translate to a lot of different traditions himself. I know Michael Dowd is a big fan of Joseph Campbell too. I really respect the project that he's taken on to upgrade Christianity and to translate a healthy version of Christianity down the spiral. So I think what he's doing is very important work. We definitely want to see trans-rational expressions of each tradition, so that way that territory is well mapped and we can all have a better understanding of what it looks like to take a trans-rational interpretation of those traditions. So that's certainly important work. The thing is that each one of these traditions has its great area of strength, but its greatest strengths are also its greatest weaknesses and limitations. You could almost think of each tradition as a different human experiment, and we can see the consequences of having valued things in this particular way. Because while each of these traditions brings its great value and its great strength, they also each tend to have their own huge blind spots and ways in which they go to extreme. We're talking about Christianity, so let's start there. Christianity is great at the lower left quadrant, at the we space. It's all about living as a vehicle of love to the world, to the second person. Like, think of the example I gave earlier about, did you see Christ in your brother? Are you really living for Christ? Are you willing to die to yourself and live for others as a vehicle of love? Are you going to love your neighbor? So it can be very good at self-sacrifice. But you also run into these problems where people can become doormats. Like, how many times should you turn the other cheek when someone slaps you? 70 times 7. Well, that just means that you're going to sit there and get slapped over and over and over again, killing someone with kindness. And that's not going to work for everyone. That's a great recipe for disaster in certain situations. That being said, each tradition does have its ways to include the other quadrants. So you could be including all 4 quadrants in your spiritual practice in a healthy way inside of each of these traditions. But you really have to be mindful and careful to do so. Buddhism tends to focus heavily on the upper left quadrant, all about God in first person. So Buddhism is mostly focused on state training practices. So basically, with a few exceptions like bodhisattvas and things like this, is that people tend to get very lost off in their own cave on their own mountaintop, and they tend to actually not care enough about the world, to not get involved enough. So they tend to neglect these other quadrants. But of course, in doing so, they've brought back tons of awesome information about how to master your own interior interiority. There's not really enough talk about paganism and magic as far as I'm concerned, but I really like the creative practices and the focusing and harnessing your will to achieve things in the world kind of practice. They've really mastered the power of mind and will and intention to create and to become. This is a great counterbalance to a lot of that stillness and being that you get in Buddhism. If you also harmonize it with the Christian idea of service and living for a greater good, if you can get all of these techniques and things together in one person, you're going to have a really powerful, healthy person and a really amazing spiritual practice. Not only can you find stillness, but you can create and become and manifest things in a way that serve the greater good. So you can actually get a really healthy balance. One of the problems of paganism is that it tends to be very much about the ego and self-serving without having mastered the self or gotten in touch with living for a greater good. So all of these things together can complement each other really well. And of course, if you bring into account philosophy, this brings the sword more online. Now we can have a good epistemology, we can have a good ontology, a good cosmology, and we can have a map of the world that we live in to be able to understand all of these factors. And we can really have both the cup and the sword. The really good thing about philosophy is that it tends to bring a very rigorous approach to truth. The bad thing about philosophy is that a lot of philosophers can tend to get very lost in their head and even get trapped in analysis paralysis and mental masturbation and all this, and they forget to come back down into the real world and do stuff. So if you can bring online this understanding, this control, this care for the greater good, and this personal interior self-mastery, you really have a complete and empowered spiritual process, and thus a complete and empowered being in the world. To me, it almost feels like being multilingual. Like I can talk to Christians and harmonize with them and point them in the direction of the greater good and give them healthy ways to integrate in these other quadrants that they might be neglecting or leaving out. I can do the same with a Buddhist. I can do the same with a pagan, and I can do the same with a philosopher. It really allows me to communicate with almost anybody and to potentially give them upgrades and tools to do better. Also, this approach really helps me to be able to see and engage with divinity in all four quadrants. It is really a holistic approach to a spiritual practice. I think if I was to dive into this a bit further, I would also talk about how a realistic understanding of reality helps you get more in touch with impermanence and gratitude. This more integral developmental approach really helps with skillful engagement and patience with people who are in these different traditions. Also, when you really care and you're really empowered and you're really engaged, there's a kind of non-dual activism that comes online where you want to engage deeply, but also you know you can only do what you can do. This is a general outline of my idea of an integral approach to religion and spirituality. I expound on these ideas further. I have other videos on my YouTube channel. I have a video about harmonizing spirituality and rationality that unpacks this stuff a lot deeper. I have a video specifically about a trans-rational interpretation of Christianity. I have a video that talks about non-dual synthesis and symbolism. Very similar to the talk I gave today, I have another talk about the 4 S's of an integral spiritual practice, which also touches these same quadrants. You might be interested in that if you enjoyed this. I also have a video deconstructing and reconstructing ideas around soul, self, awakening, afterlife, reincarnation, ghosts. What do we really think is going on with that kind of stuff? And what's a trans-rational, emergentist, realistic perspective of what's going on with this? How can we save the baby from the dirty bathwater? You heard me mention a couple criticisms about Ken Wilber and Steve McIntosh. I also have videos unpacking my criticisms around some of that stuff. If you're interested, you can find that and dig into that as well. Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth is out on Netflix now. If you have that, that would be a great thing to check out. My buddy Alyosha and I have also been working on an Integral Review Live companion series to go along book club style with these Power of Myth videos. Thanks so much for listening to me. Thanks again to Bruce and the Integral Stage for having me. If you want to hear more, find me on YouTube. Thanks again. Peace. Thanks so much for watching. Again, remember to go and check out the full-length talk on Sacred Naturalism on the Integral Stage with Michael Dowd and with Kai and with me and Layman and several of these other integral thinkers. Make sure you show some love to the Integral Stage. Definitely subscribe to their channel as well. They got lots of good integral talks coming out all the time. Make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell and check out more videos. Buy the merch, the 1K merch, the integral merch, and support me on Patreon. Big thanks to all my current Patreons. Thanks again for watching. Peace.